had a meeting with a young person in the congregation preparing for bar bat mitzvah upcoming, and I said to them, when's school starting? And it was, I don't know, I think a week's time or something like that. And I said, you looking forward to school? And they said, really, no, I'm not looking forward to school. and I said, what do you not like about school? You got friends there. And they said, well, I don't like taking tests, and having exams and those kinds of things. I said, I can understand that. And just thinking about that whole idea of testing, Merle, we were talking about it in this morning's Torah study class. So I'd like to think about it with you this morning for a few minutes, but to precede that by a story. It's one of my favorite stories. You may have heard me tell it before, so I apologize, but as it says in the Mishnah, Rabban Gamliel Haya Omer, that he was in the custom of saying. So the story is about 4 college kids who go on a road trip together over a weekend, but they have an exam Monday morning, and they just don't pay much attention to any academic information over the weekend, and so Monday morning they're driving back, the exam's at whatever, 10 o'clock, and they realize, about halfway back to school, there's no way they can take the exam. I mean, they're going to absolutely fail. So one of them says, I got a good idea. We'll stop here, and there's a payphone over there. Some of you remember what payphones are. And we'll call the professor, and we'll say that we were out of town, and we're on our way back, rushing to get to the end. We got a flat tire. Okay. So sure enough, they call. One of them calls. Professor, we're coming back, got a flat tire. Professor says, no worries. We'll schedule it for Wednesday. Today, Monday, we'll schedule it for Wednesday. You come in at such and such a time in this room, and you'll take the exam then. Don't even worry about it. Okay, great. So Wednesday, they show up on time. They walk into the room. They see 4 desks in the room, in the 4 corners of the room, so they can't sit close to one another. And there's a paper on each desk, and it's turned over, and they sit down at the desks, and the professor looks at his watch and says, okay, you may turn the paper over. And there's one question on the paper. Which tire was flat? So that's why I told it again, because it is a time of year, not only sort of academically when we think about testing, but also it's a time of year in our tradition when we begin to think about testing. And I think it was last night, or maybe yesterday morning, Rabbi Zaslow, looking towards the High Holy Days, used the term cheshbon hanefesh, which is usually translated as an accounting of the soul. But there is a sense at this time of year, I mean, think of like the Unatana Tokef text in the Machzor. Unatana Tokef is the who shall live, who shall die, that one. And there's a sense that in that text, God is sort of the professor, and God calls us into the classroom, and we have a paper on the desk, and we turn the paper over, and we do our best to answer the questions that the tradition asks of us and that God asks of us as well. And that's sort of a testing that happens on an individual basis at this time of year Jewishly. But if you think of Jewish history, Jewish history has been filled with a series of tests for Am Yisrael, for the Jewish people. If you still have your Chumash, you can open it up, and I'm going to give you a specific page. There's a passage I want to look at. If you don't have it, don't worry, we'll read it out loud. It's on page 1039. We studied this morning in the Parsha class, in the Torah study class, on page 1039, the beginning of chapter 8 in this morning's Parsha, which is Akev. So 1039, if you're following at home, you have a different Chumash or Tanakh. It's just Deuteronomy chapter 8, beginning of the page. Normally, I would ask someone to read. I'm not going to do that because if someone out there is reading, the folks watching the service can't hear you. So I'll read the passage. We're just going to read verses 1 through 6. Okay? You shall faithfully observe all the instruction that I enjoin upon you today, that you may thrive and increase and be able to possess the land that the Lord promised on oath to your fathers. Now, this is classic Deuteronomy expression of reward and punishment theology. You see it throughout Deuteronomy. The idea, if you follow the commandments, you will be rewarded. If you don't follow the commandments, you will be punished. It's not a theology I subscribe to, but you certainly find it throughout Deuteronomy. Now, here we get into an issue that has to do with testing, okay? So let's just read it carefully. Remember the long way that the Lord your God has made you travel in the wilderness these 40 years, these past 40 years, that he might test you by hardships to learn what was in your hearts, whether you would keep his commandments or not. I'm just going to give you the Hebrew there for a second. So, v'zacharta et kol haderech asher ho lichacha Adonai Elohecha. Zachar is like yizkor, right? You shall remember. So, zacharta, you will remember at kol haderech, this whole way, asher ho lichacha Adonai Elohecha, that the Lord your God has led you. Ze arba'im shana, these 40 years, bamidbar, in this wilderness. And then watch this phrase, lama'an, which means so that, anotcha lenasotcha, so that anotcha, by trials, by tribulations, lenasotcha, you will be tested. Okay? And so that's the English word, that's how you get to hardships, testing you by hardships. Keep that in mind for a second. I'm going to continue on the top of the next page, 1040. God subjected you to, so you're saying, okay, what hardships? What hardships? God subjected you to the hardship of hunger. That's taka a hardship, right? And then gave you manna to eat, which neither you nor your fathers had ever known, in order to teach you that man does not live on bread alone. Just a quick caveat, a quick side track to that. When I was a freshman in college, going back to exams and things, I had a huge poster, the only poster I had in my dorm. It was a beautiful picture of a mug full of ice-cold beer. And it had that verse on it. Man does not live by bread alone. It didn't have the Hebrew, but it had the English. Okay. And then the clothes upon you did not wear out, nor did your feet swell these 40 years. Bear in mind that the Lord your God disciplines you just as man disciplines his son. So keep the commandments of the Lord your God, walk in his ways, etc., and revere him. Okay. So anything strike you as odd about that passage? We were told that we would be tested in the wilderness. Anotcha lenasotcha. Anotcha lenasotcha. You will be tested by hardships. And then it gives a list. It gives a list. Anything strange about the list? So here's what strikes me as odd. Well, there's one hardship, yeah, which is the hunger. But after that, it's actually the opposite of hardships. It's the opposite of hardships, right? So you're saying, is it a hardship that you were given food to eat every day? So, okay, so one, or is it a hardship that you always had close to, or is it? So one answer in the tradition is, and we did talk about this in Parsha class, that the Israelites, they didn't know it would come, the manna would come every day. I mean, it did come every day, but they weren't sure. So, and we talked about this too, there's two kinds of people. Some people say, it'll be fine, don't worry, everything, the manna will show up, don't worry. And then the other kind of people, what if it's not there? What are we going to eat? There's nothing else to eat out here. I mean, so it could be that. It could be that. Okay, that's one possible answer. Merle, was there another one we talked about? Do you remember?
Well, we had said that, and I heard someone else say this, man's lack of agency. They had no hand in providing for themselves, and that's very anxiety-based.
So you're in a situation you have no control over it. That's another possible answer, and that comes up in the commentaries as well. If you look at the below-the-line commentary on page 1039, the below-the-line commentary on 1039, so that's the commentary written by Rabbi Harold Kushner of blessed memory, and you see he has a little snippet of commentary on verse 2 there, and test you by hardships. Look what he says there. Was this used to test their faith because they could never be sure that the manna would appear the next day, to Rabbi Zaslow's point? So Rabbi Zaslow, whether she knew it or not, was citing the Rashbam, one of the great medieval commentators. She knew. But then look at the next little snippet, this one sentence. Or was it to see if they would remain grateful to God even if they knew their food supply was assured? So that's a test too, actually, right? And if you think about Jewish history, we've been very accustomed over the years to tests of true hardship. And we started a list in the Torah study class this morning, but the most recent hardship was October 7th, and the year that has followed. That hardship and the hardships connected to this past year have tested all of us as Jews in different ways, and certainly tested the land of Israel. That's a test of hardship. But there is a test of bounty. That's a test too, and that's a test that the Jewish community was never used to, because not since really going back to the monarchy, so you got to go back a couple thousand years before a Jewish community had control of its own destiny and had the food that it needed to eat and wasn't suffering from hardship, until really the present day. And the Jewish community living here in the United States and in Israel, where it's not hardship maybe that's testing Jewish community. I would argue in the States, in some ways, what's testing Jewish community is the lack of hardship. And when, as a Jewish community, all of a sudden, over the last half a century, we're in a position where suddenly we can live in any neighborhood we want to live in, we can work on any job we want to work on, we can go to any university we want to go to, all of those things. And by the way, we're an affluent community, by and large, Jewish community, and we do occupy positions that are important in terms of politics, in terms of business, all across the country. And all of a sudden, in that welcome, opening, affluent atmosphere, can the Jewish community pass that test and remain true to Jewish life, Jewish ritual, Jewish behavior, and Am Yisrael, and to the Jewish people? And I would say the grade on that test is still kind of up in the air. There are a lot of demographic studies that are suggesting that the Jewish community in the States is not doing very well on that test, actually. Rates of, so hold on a sec to that. Rates of assimilation, lack of connection to synagogue community, ritual behavior. I mean, you can go down the list. A lot of. So Sonia asked an interesting question, which is, okay, so I'm gonna wrap up with this. A number of years ago, I think I've told you before that I have a collection of Rabbi Loeb's High Holy Day sermons. Most of his sermons, when he finished them, if you remember, he would jot them down on these little 5x7 pages of paper, and it was outline form, and he would give the sermon Shabbos morning. He would just walk into his office and throw it away. I saw him do it a million times, just throw it in and it kind of reminds me of when I used to say, don't throw it away, like my Uncle Marvin one time I was in New York City with him, and we went to Murray's Sturgeon Shop, which is one of the great smoked fish places in the whole world, and he was watching. We ordered some lox, and they trimmed the lox, and my Uncle Marvin's watching it, and I can see he's like getting a little drool. And the guy takes the lox trimmings and he flicks them into the garbage can. My Uncle Marvin almost jumped over there, to get that. So Rabbi Loeb gave a sermon. It was probably in the mid-'90s, I think, on Rosh Hashanah, in which he argued that anti-Semitism was gone. that there was, do you remember it, Morris? He argued there's not a way for the community to define itself anymore. And, now we know that that was not right. I mean, that was wrong. And, Rabbi Loeb, as brilliant as he was, could also be wrong. And so a number of years ago, I gave a sermon in which I argued that the true test of Jewish life today is living in acceptance. And I was wrong about that. Maybe the true test of Jewish life is figuring out how to navigate October 7th and the year that's followed since then, but in the context of a Jewish community that is highly assimilated. That may be the context. That may be the challenge of Jewish life today. And the grade we're going to get on it, we don't know. We don't know. We'll have a better sense in another year or two. But that sense of being tested, Abraham, Rosh Hashanah, Vayhi achar hadavarim ha'elev ha-Elohim nisa et Abraham, that God tests Abraham, God tests us individually, God tests us communally, and here we stand. Here we stand. We'll move forward with strength. Shabbat Shalom.